Welcome back to the Nexus Podcast. It's been a minute since we've done one of these, but I'm definitely happy to be back with you all today. I'm going to share a discussion I had with Grant Geyer. Grant is Claroty's Chief Strategy Officer. We talked about the results of a global survey of 1,100 security professionals who are working across many industries. They were surveyed about the business disruptions resulting from cyber attacks against cyber physical systems. There's some really remarkable data among these results about the financial losses that victim organizations have suffered as a result of these attacks, what plays into recovery costs, especially in ransomware attacks, which are still running wild in healthcare delivery organizations. We also talk about some of the operational impacts like downtime resulting from attacks and how intolerable that is in OT environments and healthcare especially. There's also a bit in there about supply chain attacks and third parties and how they play into business disruption if they're part of a cyber attack. So thanks as always for listening. Please subscribe to the podcast. It's really the best way to keep up with the amazing guests that I have coming up. You can also check out some of the folks I've had on this year. It's been a busy time, and I'm really proud of some of the work and some of the discussions that we've been able to bring your way. So please subscribe and check it out. So now we're ready to get into this discussion. So sit back and enjoy. Grant has some insights he shares and some recommendations, and I really think you're going to like this one.
Hello, and welcome everyone to today's discussion about Claroty's recently published survey report, The Global State of CPS Security 2024 Business Impact of Disruptions. My name is Mike Mimoso, and joining me today is Claroty Chief Strategy Officer Grant Geyer. We're going to dig into the report and the survey results. There's some good information and numbers in there about the impact of business disruptions resulting from cyber attacks that impact CPS environments. We're hoping that CISOs and other security leaders can find useful discussions and data in these survey results that they can use with the rest of the C-suite and boards of directors. The report is available at claroty.com, so I invite you to download it, check it out. There's a very short registration form required in order to get the report, and hopefully brings you some good context to these discussions that you might be having with business leaders inside your organizations right now. So let's bring in Grant and get our discussion going. All right, Grant, it's good to see you.
Great to see you, Mike.
Why is it important to frame these kinds of discussions in the context of business disruptions to CPS environments? Why is that such an important talking point for CISOs?
Yeah, I'll give you three kind of, I'll try to be super succinct, but three different areas that I think are really important. First, when we kind of back away from like the data in the report and the findings in the report, what I think it's important to understand is that there are geopolitical objectives that our adversaries are trying to achieve, and I call them the cranks: China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. And what's clear is that there's a set of objectives that these countries have been trying to achieve, geopolitical objectives for the past couple of decades, and attacks against critical infrastructure and attacks against CPS systems are just another means of accomplishing those objectives. And I think understanding it that way provides context, depending on where you are as an organization in the national, in terms of dependencies from national security, economic security, public safety. It's important to understand why you may be targeted. And even if you're targeted by a ransomware, and many times the ransomwares are helping the nation states accomplish their geopolitical objectives. So first is understanding where you are. Second is, when we see these salacious headlines about organizations getting breached and operational impact, it seems to me, when you look at press, even though there's a lot of it, when you compare that to the findings of the report show that both the volume of breaches and the operational impact are far more impactful than what we would see in the news. The third is ultimately, this is not about security. This is not about just data. This is about safety. It's about patient safety. It's about operator safety within inside plants. It's about production availability. And ultimately, what the business leaders care about who will fund these projects and who have a role to play, they have in the dog in the hunt of making these projects successful, is they think about liquidity risk, they think about supply chain risk, they think about legal risk, they think about operational risk. And we need to frame impact as a risk that has an equal seat at the table. Cybersecurity is an equal seat at the table in terms of an impact on potential disruptions and risk to the organization.
It was interesting that you brought up the cranks, as you call them, because I know at Nexus and in other discussions that we've seen, there's been like a strategic shift from some of these groups where they're purposely targeting OT. They're, the activity of Volt Typhoon kind of embedding itself in critical infrastructure. There's a lot more aggression from these gangs, so to speak, than we've seen in recent years.
What I think also sometimes is missing from the conversation, there's a lot of hoo-ha about Volt Typhoon, but what's missing for asset owner and operators is, okay, I understand that that's a real problem, but what do I do? And in many cases, the impact is not as well understood. What I think it's important to think about the adversaries when an event like that is as big of a deal as Colonial Pipeline breach happened. If you're one of our, from everything we know, the ransomers did not intend to shut down a pipeline that fed gasoline and oil to the whole eastern seaboard. But you have to imagine that if you're China and you're Russia and that happens, they're sitting back and observing and saying, that's interesting that we did that with this one organization. What else could we target? What was the impact to economic security of the nation? Like, if that happens, this is a big deal if oil and gas stops flowing in a certain part of the country. If you're in Russia, you may call that day Tuesday, maybe it's Wednesday, right? And so the dependence on critical infrastructure is so high within the Western world that it has a different import, and also potentially changes the relationship between our citizenry and the government, where the citizens may say, we can't trust the government to protect us, which is one of the geopolitical objectives behind this, is to sow seeds of doubt in the Western way of politics, the Western way of operating.
So let's look at some of the specific results. And there were kind of 4 or 5 key sets of key findings that really surfaced. But I mean, if we're talking numbers, some of the most impactful numbers that came out of the survey, more than a quarter of respondents globally reported $1 million or more in financial losses resulting from an attack that impacted CPS. And there were a lot of factors that went into this, like some of them were obvious, like lost revenue, but there are a lot of subtle costs in there, as well as like employee overtime that had to be paid out in addition to other recovery costs. What does this tell you? I mean, are you surprised by some of these steep costs? I know you kind of hinted that these numbers were pretty eye-opening.
It's like we ran a survey similar to this a few years back, and every time I see the results, it's just like it is such a disparity from what we hear reported publicly and what we actually see in the results. One of the things that I thought was really, I wasn't totally surprised by it, but I think it was like 78% of healthcare delivery organizations reported a financial loss of greater than $500,000 in terms of recovery costs. So it was more pronounced, and I don't know if you're going to get into that later, but it was actually more pronounced in health organizations than it was on industrial organizations. And I think it speaks, as you said, that there are direct costs in terms of like paying the ransom. I think we'll talk about that next. But there's these indirect and subtle costs, such as you said, employee overtime, backup and recovery, all of these other. Also potential impact to patient safety. There's a report that was actually published by CISA during the pandemic that showed that there's such a reliance in hospitals on cyber physical systems and on technology that putting excess strain on the system from ransomware statistically was proven to have caused excess deaths because the system couldn't handle that additional strain. I think those intangible, subtle yet very, concerning areas, and there was some impact on patient safety actually talked about within this array. I think those are ones that really need to be surfaced and need to be thought about as kind of a total cost of ownership and how you invest in cyber physical system protection programs to avoid these types of incidents so that you don't spend as much on the response and recovery phases.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about some of the ransomware numbers. I mean, a lot of these numbers that surfaced in the report were related to recovery costs. 53% of respondents said that they met ransom demands of more than a $500,000. You brought up the 78% of healthcare organizations meeting those demands. Some of this kind of flies in the face of advice from law enforcement and even security researchers not to engage with these guys and pay the ransom. But I would imagine that the reality is a lot different, and these are very difficult discussions within these victimized organizations about, we need to get back online.
It kind of bothers me, some of this, like, I'll call it idealistic, morally superior conversations. And sorry, I'm getting on a soapbox here. These morally conversations, well, you shouldn't pay the ransom, because the reality is many organizations don't have the optionality to not pay the ransom. If you don't have a backup program and you don't know that you have the data and you can recover the data with a reasonable recovery point, you have no optionality. It's not really about how you morally think about the issue. It's about pragmatically enabling your organization to survive, produce its products, and continue paying the bills and continue paying the employees. So I think that that's the way I try to think about it. But again, it puts emphasis on ensuring that your focus and your investment is shifting left and can be focused on investing in practicing these types of response recovery operations, so that in the eventuality of a problem, you can get operations back online as quickly as possible.
I want to cover some of the results around operational impact, since we're kind of dancing around that as well. There are some significant findings around downtime. Half of the organizations that responded to the survey were experiencing at least 12 hours of downtime, up to a day or even a week in some cases, sometimes more in very extreme cases. Explain, just kind of cover from a high level, how detrimental downtime is to CPS in organizations and environments, especially, I think it's obvious in healthcare, but even in industrial, the consequences here, these aren't inconsequential numbers and findings.
No, and I think sometimes there's questions regarding, like, even though the cyber physical systems may not be directly targeted or directly impacted, an organization may not be able to execute core processes that have dependencies on those IT systems. In many cases, again, in the case of Colonial Pipeline, the organization couldn't positively assert that the breach in IT didn't reach the OT environment, and so that caused a shutdown. And there's direct impact on human-machine interfaces, engineering workstations. There was a case that we looked at, our Team 82 looked at a few months ago, where Iranian hackers attacked systems, attacked the software repos, or were able to get access to the software repos to an organization that produces metal cutting equipment, and they had claimed that they had compromised and put backdoors into that. And so if you compromise the engineering software, the CAD/CAM software, or the engineering workstation software, you could potentially leverage that backdoor to cause equipment to be sabotaged. You could cause designs to be flawed, which could impact product security for the end users of those systems. Or you could just take the systems down and offline, which doesn't enable the organization to produce product. Or depending on where you can impact operations, if you're an attacker, there can be a lot of wasted product that isn't completed, that can't be restarted. And so there's a lot of waste that happens in the product. So there's various ways that there can be operational impact associated with that, which is why it's so important to think through different techniques that we can talk through on how to protect this type of equipment.
Sure. I think that's a great lead into some of the cybersecurity impacts that surfaced out of the survey. I found some of the numbers around, like, process manipulation and process disruption were kind of concerning. Almost 40% of respondents said they experienced some kind of manipulation and or disruption to process as a result of attack. What is that an indication of to you? Are we talking about advanced attacks here? And how much do those numbers, how much do they concern you?
That's one of the areas that I found a bit surprising because we don't hear a lot about process manipulation. Like what is a lot more common is might be an engineering workstation or HMI being shut down. Where we do hear about process manipulation are things like advanced nation states that are trying to cause a purposeful impact in like the electric utility grid within Ukraine or the attacks against the Guam naval base. Like those are very purposeful kind of live off the land techniques. We don't hear a lot about this. So and we don't have kind of like the commentary that the respondents could add. So I'm a little. My guess is that people may have inadvertently confused process manipulation with operational impact, or in terms of an impact to operations. So that one I think we need to dig into further.
So before we wrap up, definitely want to talk about some of the numbers that came up around remote access and around third-party supply chain incidents that were also contributing to significant losses. And, I know we've published some different research around remote access this year, and it seems like we can't get users away from relying primarily on VPNs, for example, as a tunnel into CPS environments. Can you kind of explain again why this isn't inadequate approach, and there are some serious shortcomings here as opposed to using kind of a purpose-built solution?
And this is, like, to me, such an important finding. I kind of wish that this were the first point in the report, because like we did an analysis which we published separately in our data lake, and kind of found that organizations are rife with remote access software. And I think we reported that 22% of organizations, I'll actually look it up real quick, 22% of organizations had more than 8 different unique forms of remote access into the environment, some of as many as 15 or 16 that we found. And look, there's certain times this is done purposefully by employees that need access to an asset, or maybe during a troubleshooting or some type of emergency, they set it up. A lot of these tools are easy enough for users to set up, and the default configurations are not with multi-factor authentication. And sometimes the OEMs bring their own remote access solution with them. The key here is that a lot of IT tools that are repurposed or used for OT or cyber physical system use cases don't take into account the operational, environmental, and risk tolerance constraints that are unique to these environments, such as like comporting with IEC 62443, management of change principles, and that side skirts or can walk directly around some of the most important controls that organizations have in order to lock down the environment and ensure that users are who they claim to be and their rights are appropriate for what they need to get done. And so that was, a key finding in the report. And it shouldn't surprise us that one of the most active ways that adversaries are breaking into environments is with remote access, given the fact that, especially during the pandemic, there was a flurry of very rapid deployment so that employees that couldn't travel to site were able to access and make decisions and do maintenance to improve mean time to repair. So I think that's one of the most important areas. And one of the things that people ask me for advice, it's really getting their remote access, their secure access under control, and try to develop a vendor hub to force all vendors to go into one hub so you could do management, administration, and governance and effective security of all the vendors logging into the environment.
Mm-hmm. It was another kind of big number that popped up that's related is that 82% of respondents said at least one attack originated from third-party supplier access to the CPS environment. This has to be a big challenge for organizations because not a lot of them have the buying power or to insist on certain controls from suppliers, et cetera. Is that a fair comment? Or, what can be done in these instances?
Well, if you think about it, in many cases when the supplier has access, unless it's done in very specific ways, where it's individual users providing granted access to specific assets, you're basically opening up their entire environment into your environment, and anyone with access, and a lot of times it's shared passwords, anyone with access has free reign into the environment, or if an attacker gets in, you are assuming their problem. So I think that that's core to the challenge. In addition to that, even if they're not able to do that, the fact is, if it's their tools with their access and you don't have the ability to approve access, there's no identity governance in place. There's no ability to record sessions and view those sessions. And so you're creating one of the biggest risks is then operationalized as and can be materialized really without any means of effectively controlling it. That's why I think this 82% number is as high as it is.
Mm-hmm. And just so that it's not all gloom and doom, there were some positive numbers that some respondents were able to maybe, leverage these incidents is the right way to put it, but just to use this to establish new security protocols with suppliers or renegotiate pricing. I don't know if that's kind of a norm here, but it was worth noting that it did pop up.
Yeah, there was also some optimism expressed in terms of how organizations felt like it was going to get better in the future. And I think
right.
This is sort of kinetic energy and potential energy. Like if I go back 4 years ago and think about when I first got engaged in this area of cybersecurity, people really didn't even understand the problem space or were busy admiring the problem. People didn't even start their visibility programs. And the fact that that operators are now seeing this as trending in the right direction is suggestive that even though these projects take time to operationalize and the actual risk takes time to be mitigated, it shows that there is progress being made. And so we hope to see that in future reports, hope springs eternal, but we hope to see that some of the risk will be and impact will be going down to organizations. We can only hope, given the fact that so much is riding on cyber physical systems as these digital equipment touches and impacts the physical world. Yeah.
All right, so let's wrap up. I just want to get some closing thoughts from you, just overall on the results. And some of the numbers seem to indicate that most organizations are still in a reactive mode with regard to incidents, and real change kind of only happens if there's some sort of compromise. Is there a path forward to kind of evolve away from this approach and be more proactive about securing these environments?
Yeah, and I think it's important to get agency back, to take agency back. To me, there's three core processes you have to get right. That's around exposure management, which we think of as transitioning from traditional vulnerability management to much more targeted and purposeful way of doing vulnerability management based upon the actual exposures and risks that you have. Second is around network segmentation, because vulnerabilities may be hard to patch or may not even possible to do. We think it's important to take entire classes of risk off the table by putting segmentation in place to protect machine-to-machine and cloud workload-to-machine communications. Third is around securing third-party remote access so you can secure user-to-machine communications. Because our job as security practitioners, right, it's not just to secure the environment, it's to enable the business to responsibly advance its agenda and accomplish the digital transformation goals. And so much in these environments is around securing user-to-machine, machine-to-machine, cloud workload-to-machine communications. The last thing I'll say, and I love when the director Easterly talked about this on stage in Black Hat, she talked about kind of the 4 V's: vendors, villains, victims, and visionaries. And the fact is, we oftentimes talk about the villains, and we as security practitioners are the victims, right? And kind of it's you lose agency, however, if you only think about those 2 V's. The third V, I think, is the most critical one, which is also bringing the vendors into the equation. And there's great work being done by Secure by Demand and Secure by Design by CISA. And key, I think, for practitioners is secure by demand, meaning you gain agency back by running your vendor management program and thinking about what requirements you expect from a cybersecurity perspective for your CPS equipment before, during, and after your procurement cycles, right? So that enables us to be a force multiplier, maybe not today or tomorrow, but planting those seeds now that will get a positive impact to the overall problem space years down the road, I think is incredibly important.
All right, Grant, always great to catch up with you. And thanks for the time today. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Good luck out there.